Fusion power is often treated as the foundation of humanity's future energy systems, but no civilization should be built on a single, unproven assumption. For most of the last century, fusion power has occupied a strange place in our collective imagination. It's always just around the corner, always one breakthrough away, always 20 or 30 years from solving energy forever. And to be clear, that optimism is not baseless. There was a burst of early over-optimism because of how quickly we got fission power working, and then a fission bomb. So we got a fusion bomb not long after. Many people assumed a fusion reactor must be just over the horizon, and maybe it is, now. But when we learn more particle physics and crest the next hill, we find ourselves staring at a very distant horizon, with a very long and difficult road ahead. Still, we've made real progress. Better confinement, better materials, better modeling. Even moments where fusion reactions briefly produced more energy than they consumed. If fusion works, it will be one of the most transformative technologies humanity ever develops. But there's a difference between something being physically possible and it being practical, economical, and scalable enough to matter. Fusion doesn't just have to work in a lab, it has to work reliably, continuously, affordably, and in competition with energy sources we already have, and those alternatives are improving fast themselves. Now, let me put a caveat on that. Fusion doesn't really have to compete with every power source, just the ones capable of serving as long-term baseload power. And if we're being honest, that list is fairly short. Fission, space-based solar, geothermal, and biofuels. Those last two are definitely not optimal either. Most of the sources either don't have very long-term supplies or don't operate all day every day. But that picture can change. If we get ultra-cheap batteries, for instance, then solar, or even wind or tidal, effectively become baseload sources too, because they work through foul weather and long nights alike. More importantly, civilizations don't get to pause while waiting for miracles. They don't get to say, once fusion arrives, then we'll solve our problems. History doesn't work that way, and neither does infrastructure. Power grids, cities, industries, and economies grow around what works now, not what might work someday. Right now, coal and oil still work quite well from an infrastructure standpoint, and we still have a lot of them, even if we prefer not to rely on them. Even ignoring environmental concerns, they're decidedly finite. Everything is, but much more so than most of our other long-term options. A fusion would be nicer sooner rather than later, but from a civilization planning perspective, needing a few centuries to make fusion work economically is very different from never. At the same time, the road forward looks much the same whether fusion is half a millennium away or half a forever. If it's not arriving in a generation or two, we can't just wait around. So today we're asking a different question. Not whether fusion will ever work, but what happens if it doesn't, or if it arrives late, or if it never quite becomes cheap enough to dominate? What kind of future do we build if fusion never becomes our primary energy source? How does civilization adapt? How do options change for industry, climate, and space travel? And perhaps most importantly, what does that mean for life on Earth today? Because a civilization that only functions if fusion arrives is a fragile one. A civilization that thrives without it is resilient, and if fusion does arrive later, that's just a bonus. What fusion actually changes, and what it doesn't. Fusion power is often treated as a kind of technological singularity for energy, as though once it arrives, every other constraint simply evaporates. Infinite clean power, limitless growth, starships everywhere. But fusion doesn't abolish the rules of physics or economics. It just shifts where the bottlenecks are. What fusion offers, if it works, is dense dispatchable energy, enormous amounts of power from a small amount of fuel, available on demand, without carbon emissions, and with a fuel supply that is very nearly infinite, even if we are limited to rarer fuels like deuterium or helium-3 rather than plain hydrogen. An energy-dense, abundant fuel with no dangerous, long-lived waste. That combination is rare and is genuinely valuable. It matters most in places where energy density is critical, spacecraft especially, but also remote installations, bunkered facilities, and possibly high-throughput industrial centers where space and fuel logistics are limiting factors. But fusion doesn't eliminate infrastructure. You still need reactors, cooling systems, transmission lines, maintenance crews, regulatory frameworks, and massive capital investment. You still have waste heat to deal with, you still have downtime, material fatigue, and political realities. And critically, fusion doesn't arrive into a vacuum. It divides into an energy market already saturated with alternatives that are cheap, continually improving, and already widely deployed. That's the part that often gets overlooked. Fusion is not competing with coal from the 1950s or solar panels in the 1990s. It is competing with modern renewables that are already among the cheapest energy sources ever created, and with nuclear fission technologies that can run for decades on a single fuel load. By the time fusion is commercially viable, if it ever is, the rest of the energy landscape will have advanced dramatically as well. That's a very good thing for us, and that's why SFA's unofficial energy policy has always been research and prototype everything. It's nice to be spoiled for options, and hard to say in advance which approach will truly pan out as the most economic. You also don't really want to be limited to a single power source anyway. It's good to have multiple options available and in use, even if some cost 10 or 15% more, because that adds redundancy and resilience against changing technologies, market shocks, cartels, or embargoes. You also tend to get mixes that work better than a single solution alone. One thing the US did back in the day that was both smart and dumb was running electricity to every house. Even the cost of building and maintaining lines to very rural homes was often higher than simply running a local generator would have been. It made sense because we also had phone lines everywhere, but those are largely redundant now. It may turn out that a city running on a fission or fusion reactor, rural homes running on solar with batteries and backup generators, and suburbs using some hybrid or third approach is wiser and more efficient overall. It is also very likely that fusion reactors can only be made so small. That means ships at sea, car, or aircraft probably won't use them directly. Or maybe only the biggest ships like container ships or aircraft carriers. Instead, we may use fusion reactors to make carbon-neutral hydrocarbon fuels, charge massive battery systems, or even to manufacture radioisotopes for radioisotope thermal generators, or fuel for fission reactors. Those considerations become especially important when we start talking about power generation off Earth and far from the Sun later on. There's also a tendency to blur two very different questions: whether fusion can produce net energy, and whether it can produce net value. A reactor that barely breaks even energetically but costs billions to build and operate does not revolutionize civilization. It becomes a niche solution, a prestige project, or something governments subsidize for strategic reasons. It's not failure, but it's not the energy messiah either. Fusion also doesn't automatically unlock post-scarcity. Energy abundance helps, but abundance isn't just about generation. It's about distribution, storage, timing, and demand. A gigawatt produced at the wrong place or wrong time isn't very useful. Civilization doesn't run on total energy produced. It runs on energy delivered when and where it's needed. So if fusion works, it changes the equation. It makes certain problems easier. It opens new options for space propulsion, remote power generation, and high-energy industrial processes, but it doesn't magically erase the need for grid, storage, efficiency, or intelligent planning. And if fusion never arrives, or arrives late, or remains expensive, civilization doesn't stall out. It adapts around what already works. Which brings us to the most important point. Fusion is not a prerequisite for a thriving technological civilization. It's a potential upgrade, not a foundation. Humanity doesn't need a miracle to build a sustainable advanced future. We just need to be honest about the tools we already have and smart about how we use them. The energy sources we already know work. If fusion never becomes practical, the first thing to note is that we are not starting from zero. We already have multiple energy sources that work at civilization scale, have known supply chains, and can plausibly support an advanced technological society for centuries or longer. In many cases, they already are. Solar power is the most obvious example and also the most frequently underestimated. It's now among the cheapest energy sources ever deployed, not in theory but in practice, across large parts of the world. It scales absurdly well, because the fuel source is not just abundant, but delivered directly to every inhabited region of the planet every day. In a very real sense, it's already where virtually all of our heat and food ultimately come from, whether we notice it or not. It's also proof that fusion can work, since that is where solar power comes from after all. And while solar is often framed as intermittent and supplemental, that framing is increasingly outdated even if we start talking about space-based solar. Large fractions of modern electrical grids already run on solar during daylight hours, and the storage is steadily turning what used to be a timing problem into an engineering one. Solar isn't waiting for a breakthrough. It's already crossing the threshold into infrastructure. Space-based solar pushes that logic even further. By collecting energy above the atmosphere, where sunlight is constant and unobstructed, orbital solar arrays sidestep weather, seasonal variation, and night cycles entirely. Power can be beamed down where and when it's needed, turning solar into something much closer to a controllable baseload source. Even with existing technology and space infrastructure, such systems would already be borderline economical to deploy, and that picture only improves as our presence and capability in space expands. The challenges here are not fundamental physics, but launch costs, orbital construction, and political coordination. Hard problems, but familiar ones, and ones that tend to trend downward over time. Wind power is a bit of a different story, as it cannot be scaled up beyond Earth. It is regionally dependent, sometimes unpredictable, and often dismissed as unreliable, but in practice is already a major contributor to grid stability in many areas. Wind and solar complement each other geographically and temporally, and when combined with other sources, they reduce strain on the baseload systems rather than replacing them outright. Hydroelectric and geothermal power occupy a quieter but critical role. They are not universally available, but where they exist, they offer reliable long-term power without exotic technology or speculative physics. Geothermal in particular is often overlooked, despite the fact that it can function as true baseload power for decades with minimal fuel concerns, at least for certain areas, or if you're willing to drill deeper, which will probably get cheaper and easier. So these sources don't necessarily scale well everywhere, but civilization doesn't need every solution everywhere. Then there's nuclear fission. It's unfashionable in some circles, controversial in others, but it remains one of the most mature, dispatchable, and energy-dense power sources humanity has ever built. A single reactor can power a city for decades on a relatively small fuel supply, and advanced fuel cycles extend that timeline dramatically. Breeder reactors and thorium-based systems push viable fuel availability out to millennia, not decades. Fission's limitations are real. They are largely political, economic, and institutional rather than physical. Waste management, for instance, is often framed as an unsolved problem, when in reality it is a solved engineering problem with unresolved social acceptance. If fusion never works, fission doesn't suddenly stop working either. It remains one of the most straightforward ways to provide large amounts of reliable power with minimal land use. It is also worth remembering that civilization doesn't run purely on electricity. Chemical fuels remain incredibly energy-dense, portable, and flexible, which is why we still rely on them so heavily for transportation, industry, and backup power. The key point is that chemical fuels don't have to be fossil fuels. With abundant electricity, whether from fission, renewables, or some mix, we can synthesize hydrocarbons, ammonia, or other fuels that are carbon neutral and compatible with existing infrastructure. That matters because it lets civilization decarbonize without tearing itself apart. Instead of replacing every engine, vehicle, ship, and aircraft, we can replace where the fuel comes from. In a world without fusion, synthetic fuels become a bridge between abundant electricity and the parts of civilization that need dense, portable energy. Taken together, these sources do not form a single perfect solution, but they don't need to. Civilization has never relied on one energy source alone. Coal did not eliminate wood overnight. Oil didn't eliminate coal. Electricity didn't eliminate mechanical power. Energy systems layer, overlap, and adapt, and a future without fusion would simply continue that pattern. Is energy storage the real star? If there's one theme that quietly undercuts the entire fusion or bust market, it's energy storage. Generation matters, but storage is what turns energy into a usable system rather than a momentary event. Civilization does not actually need infinite power. It needs power when it wants it, where it wants it, and in the form it wants it. That's a storage problem as much as a generation problem. Grid-scale batteries are the most visible example, but they are far from the only one. Batteries smooth out daily cycles, stabilize grids, and turn intermittent sources into predictable ones. As costs fall and lifetime improves, they increasingly function as infrastructure rather than accessories, but they're just one piece of a much larger toolkit. Thermal storage allows excess energy to be banked as heat, released later for industrial processes, district heating, or electricity generation. Molten salts, hot rock, underground reservoirs. These approaches are boring in the best possible way, relying on simple physics rather than speculative breakthroughs. Gravity-based storage works on similar principles. Pumped hydro, lifted masses, compressed air. These systems store energy mechanically, often with round-trip efficiencies that are more than good enough for grid stabilization. They don't care whether the power comes from solar, wind, fission, or something else entirely. Then there are chemical fuels. Excess electricity can be used to split water, synthesize fuels, or create long-lived energy carriers that can be transported, stored, and burned when needed. From a systems perspective, this is storage disguised as fuel production. It's how you turn a surplus at noon into reliability at midnight, or a windy week into resilience during a calm one. But together, storage changes the nature of energy conservation. Renewables stop being intermittent and instead become scheduled. Baseload becomes less about constant generation and more about guaranteed availability. In effect, storage lets us build pseudo-baseload systems out of sources that were never designed to be baseload in the first place. This is why fusion, if it arrives, won't be the sole pillar of holding civilization up. It'll be one more generator feeding to a web of storage, distribution, and demand management that already exists. If fusion never arrives in any format smaller than a star, that web doesn't collapse, just keeps getting thicker and more capable. In many ways, the future of energy isn't about discovering a perfect source. It's about learning how to juggle imperfect ones intelligently. Storage is what makes that juggling act possible, and it's already reshaping how civilization thinks about power, whether fusion ever joins the mix or not. Space travel without fusion. Fusion often gets treated as the gateway technology for becoming a spacefaring civilization, but that framing overstates its importance, at least in the near to medium term. Most of the space development humanity is likely to pursue over the next several centuries does not actually require fusion at all. Solar electric propulsion already dominates the efficiency gain for moving cargo and infrastructure around the inner solar system. Ion drives, Hall thrusters, related systems are slow, but they're all extraordinarily fuel efficient, which matters far more than raw thrust when you're building logistics networks rather than heroic one-off missions. If you're moving habitats, raw materials, or station components, time is usually cheaper than fuel. All the way to the asteroid belt, at least. Solar power is an abundant, all-day-round power source that also doesn't need to be built sturdy with weather and gravity in mind, so you can do thin aluminum foil mirrors massing nearly nothing and costing about the same for bouncing concentrated light onto solar collectors as you head deeper out. For low, continuous thrust operations, solar is great. For missions where solar power becomes less effective, nuclear fission fills the gap quite comfortably. We've covered that in depth in past episodes, but the short version is that compact fission reactors provide reliable long-duration power for spacecraft operating far from the sun. They are well within known physics, scale sensibly, and do not require speculative breakthroughs to be useful. Deep space probes, outer system installations, and long-duration crewed missions are all feasible with fission-based systems. Beyond onboard power, beamed energy opens up additional options. Whether it's lasers, microwaves, or other directed energy systems, power doesn't always need to travel with the spacecraft. Energy beaming and relay networks, something we discussed in episodes on interstellar relays and power transmission, allow spacecraft to offload much of their mass and complexity, relying instead on infrastructure that grows over time. That's a very civilization-style approach to space travel. All of this means that without fusion, humanity still spreads naturally through the inner solar system, the asteroid belt, and even out to the moons of Jupiter and beyond. Fusion changes how fast we can do this, not how far. It shortens travel times, simplifies some mission profiles, and opens up more aggressive propulsion concepts that can outdo Orion or Medusa drives. But those are upgrades, not prerequisites. In other words, fusion doesn't determine whether humanity expands into space. It determines how quickly and how comfortably we do so. A fusion-powered future is faster and flashier, but a non-fusion future still gets there, just with more patience and more infrastructure. How far from the sun can we go? One of the most persistent myths in space futurism is that fusion is required to leave the inner solar system in any meaningful way. In reality, the question of how far from the sun we can go has much to do with power management and infrastructure than with any single energy source. Solar intensity does fall off rapidly with distance, and that matters. At Jupiter, the sunlight is roughly 25 times weaker than at Earth. By the time you reach Saturn or Uranus, solar power becomes increasingly marginal for anything beyond modest systems. But marginal does not mean impossible, and so it doesn't mean uninhabitable. As mentioned, solar is cheap to concentrate when a thin mirror is all you need. But the key distinction is between generating power locally and importing it. Local power generation, whether via fission reactors, radioisotope systems, or even limited geothermal activity on certain moons, allows settlement to function independently of sunlight. Imported power through beaming or fuel shipments allows high-energy activities to take place even when local generation is sparse. Neither approach requires fusion. Most human populations, however, are still likely to cluster close to stars, regardless of energy technology. Stars provide not just power, but heat gradients, easier chemistry, faster industrial cycles, and shorter communication and travel delays. Even with fusion, there's little incentive to push the bulk of civilization far into the dark unless there's a compelling reason to do so. That's why the idea that we need fusion to escape the inner system is misleading. Without fusion, humanity can still expand outward gradually, establishing nodes of activity wherever resources justify them. With fusion, that expansion accelerates, but doesn't fundamentally change where civilization wants to be. As we see in episodes like Deep Space Habitats and Interstellar City-States, there is more than enough fission fuel to run large, long-lived economies out in the deep void. And even if those economies would be tiny compared to a Cartership 2 civilization, concentrated in the inner system, they could still operate indefinitely. And they could still be larger than modern civilization. Without fusion, if you ever start running low on uranium or thorium, you don't simply go dark. You use abundant power close to the sun, whether from fission or solar, to manufacture new fuel from more common elements and ship it outward. That keeps the torches lit in the outer darkness between the stars, and keeps the long roads illuminated for the starships plowing through them at night. Ultimately, distance from the sun is less a hard limit and more a question of economics, logistics, and purpose. Fusion shifts those equations, but it doesn't define them. Even in a future where fusion never arrives, the solar system remains very much open for business, as does the galaxy beyond it. The psychological trap of waiting for fusion. We're seeing today that we have a lot of options beside fusion. I would reiterate my own belief that I think economical fusion is coming, even if I don't think it is imminent. Don't bet your portfolio on it arriving soon, but it could too, so don't bet against it. Just bet on energy abundance not being too far off. But there's another cost to betting too heavily on fusion. It has less to do with physics or engineering than with psychology. When a technology is framed as inevitable and transformative enough, it can quietly turn into a kind of technological messiah, something that will arrive someday and absolve us of the need to make hard choices in the meantime. You can see this pattern repeated throughout history. Once we discover X, everything will change. Once this breakthrough happens, the rest becomes easy. It's comforting, but it's also paralyzing. Planning gets deferred, infrastructure investment slows, responsibility shifts from the present to a hypothetical future where problems are assumed to solve themselves. A robust economy that's been upgraded with tech you have might need expensive upgrades just a decade later when newer tech arrives, but it will have the resources to swallow that second investment easier than a half-paralyzed and eroded economy that waited too long to make upgrades gambling on a future tech. Fusion often occupies that role in energy discussions. Once fusion arrives, we'll clean up the grid. Once fusion arrives, we'll decarbonize industry. Once fusion arrives, space becomes easy. The danger isn't believing fusion might work, it's allowing that belief to become an excuse not to plan for a future that has to function regardless. Civilizations don't collapse because they lack miracles. They struggle when they fail to adapt using the tools they already have. Waiting for fusion as a prerequisite for progress risks turning an engineering challenge into a cultural blind spot, where obvious, workable solutions get postponed because they don't feel definitive enough. This isn't an argument against ambition. This is SFIA after all. Rather, it's an argument against outsourcing responsibility to the future. Planning for a world without fusion forces us to think in terms of resilience, redundancy, and gradual improvement rather than a single-point salvation. And those are the same traits that make civilizations robust even when breakthroughs do arrive. Fusion is a promise. Civilization must be a plan. Civilization does not usually end because one thing goes wrong. It ends because one rare catastrophe arrives before anyone has built the tools, backups, and redundancies to survive it. Ice ages, solar flares, rogue planets, supernovae, lost archives, failed recoveries. These are not just disasters. They are stress tests for whether a civilization has become durable. That is the idea behind my new Nebula Plus collection, Cosmic Catastrophes and Survival. It gathers my Nebula-exclusive episodes on extinction risks, planetary disasters, civilization backups, and rebuilding after collapse. This month's new edition is Nearby Supernovae. Could one destroy Earth, and could we stop it? Where we look at whether exploding stars have threatened Earth before, which nearby stars might eventually explode, and whether a future civilization could shield itself, move the danger away, or harvest the aftermath. If that sounds like your sort of rabbit hole, you can find the full collection on Nebula, along with years of SFA exclusives, collections, bonus episodes, and regular episodes early and ad-free. My link or the QR code gets you 50% off an annual plan, or 40% off lifetime access. Fusion as a bonus, not a crutch. I want to emphasize again that none of this is meant to dismiss fusion research or downplay its potential. Fusion might arrive sooner than expected or much later, or in forms that look very different from what we currently imagine. We might finally get a commercial fusion reactor built, only for someone to invent a pocket-sized vacuum energy tap, or a matter-to-energy converter that costs $5 to make and renders the whole debate moot. Or fusion might roll out unevenly, powering some regions or applications long before others. If that happens, a civilization that has already learned to thrive without fusion will be perfectly positioned to take advantage of it. Fusion becomes an upgrade, not a dependency. A multiplier, not a foundation. Something that accelerates progress rather than something progress has been waiting on. The real takeaway here is that humanity's future is not balanced on a single technological breakthrough. We already have the means to build a sustainable, spacefaring, long-lived civilization using known physics, mature technologies, and systems that scale incrementally rather than explosively. Fusion can make that future faster and more efficient, but it does not define whether it exists at all. The future does not require a miracle, it just rewards preparation.